Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Chantel and today I'm going to be talking about the Tawny Man Trilogy by Robin Hobb. So let's get into it, shall we? The first part of this video, the shorter part of this video, is going to be my non-spoilery thoughts on this trilogy for folks who have not yet read it. If anyone is watching this who has not yet read it, I will be doing a few minutes of general talk about this trilogy that do not contain any spoilers, and then at a certain point I will switch over to a more spoilery discussion of things that actually happen in these books, because I'm deep enough in the Realm of the Elderlings series at this point that it is difficult for me to talk specifically about the character development and the plot development and the world building at this point without it becoming what most people would consider spoilery. So I'm going to say a little bit in general about it, that it does not involve spoilers, and then I'm going to dive into a more in-depth discussion in which I'm going to assume that you have either read the books or don't care about knowing all the stuff that happens in them, because I'm going to talk about some of the things that happen. So that's what we're doing today. So I'm discussing specifically the 3 books of the Tawny Man Trilogy, that is Fool's Errand, Golden Fool, and Fool's Fate. These are the 3 books in this trilogy, but they are also the 3rd trilogy in the Realm of the Elderlings series, and I am going to be referencing the previous 2 trilogies to some extent in my discussion of this trilogy, especially in the spoilery part of it, because that's what I want to do. I want to talk about it. So that's what we're doing today. So yeah, first and foremost, the non-spoilery stuff. This is definitely, I've said this before, and I'm going to reiterate this now that I've finished the trilogy. This is my favorite so far of the Realm of the Elderlings series. This trilogy of novels is by far my favorite, and that's really saying something, because all of the previous novels were essentially 5-star, 10 out of 10, no notes kind of books, and these are sort of even more so, right? These are even a half a step above those in my estimation, personally. There's a few reasons for this. I think the main reason for this is that not only are we returning to Fitz as our primary protagonist, which I really like, but the focus on Fitz in this trilogy is, I think, much more in line with my tastes and my interests. Some of this definitely has to do with the fact that Fitz is older in this trilogy than he was in the Farseer trilogy, right? The Farseer trilogy covers basically his childhood and adolescence, and he's, maybe 18 at the oldest at the end of the Farseer trilogy, and now we're like 16 years later, so he's in his 30s, still younger than me, but closer to my age. And concomitantly, this trilogy shows him as being a little bit more mature. His understanding of the world is much more mature, and the problems that he encounters and deals with are, relatedly are more mature and have to do with things that are more commonly associated with being an adult, right? Just the general themes, the general subject matter that is being dealt with, that the way that he interacts in his relationships with other people is more based on, again, that sort of, he has more experience of the world, he's older, he has a more nuanced understanding of things, and he's dealing with problems that adults are more likely to deal with, right? So we're dealing with issues like grief and trauma and reckoning with the past and reckoning with our own decisions and the decisions of others and how they affect us in over a longer period of time is, I think, one of the things that makes this so much more compelling to me even than the Farseer trilogy, which, again, this is not me putting down the Farseer trilogy. I really loved the Farseer trilogy. I thought it was great. But there's something, again, it's just more mature. It feels more nuanced. It feels like, Fitz just has a better understanding of the world, and thus we have a better understanding of the world because he is our primary POV character. Other things that I think draw me more towards this one is the darker tone. It's not that the previous two didn't have their darkness in them, but again, because I think Fitz is older, because he's dealing with more things, it feels like a darker middle section of a trilogy in some ways, right? In some ways, this is kind of the darker middle section of the trilogy, because this is the second of the 3 Fitz trilogies in this series. And in some ways, it does feel like that. And also, I really appreciate the way that Robin Hobb has developed the world and brought us along this journey to a point where we have this greater understanding. So it starts out, she's just very good at starting us from a place where, and building sort of organically over the course of all of these now 9 novels that I have read, to a point where this world is complicated, it's vast, it's much bigger than what it first felt like it was when we started out. And Hobb is just really, really good at drawing all the threads of plot and world building together in ways that feel really, really satisfying, and feel like we're getting a better, more complex portrait of the characters and this whole world as the story builds, and I really, really like that progression that she's given us. So that's another thing that contributes to why I like this so much. And of course, I think some of it is just that my emotional investment is deeper the further in I go, and so I feel more for the characters the farther in we get. And, I'll talk a little bit in more detail in the spoilery section. But yeah, so the Tawny Man Trilogy is great. It is my favorite so far. I think, honestly, I do think Golden Fool is my favorite of the trilogy for a few reasons that I'll get into in the spoilery section. But all 3 of these books put together create something that it's hard to separate them from each other, really. But they do stand out as a trilogy from the rest of the Realm of the Elderlings series. So, yeah, I guess the non-spoilery takeaway from this is that I really like these books, and if you haven't been reading Realm of the Elderlings, you need to, immediately. What are you doing with your life? Get on that. So now this is the point at which I'm going to start talking about spoilers, right? So if you haven't read the books and you don't want to know, then you should turn this video off now and go watch something else. Or just go read the Realm of the Elderlings books and then come back and watch the rest of this video. Because I'm now going to start talking about things that happen in this trilogy. So, you've been warned. You have been warned. That's it. So, I think one of the things that I think I can understand why some people would find off-putting about this trilogy and why they would prefer the Farseer trilogy is, of course, the fact that Night Eyes dies. And I think Night Eyes' death very much looms large over this trilogy, despite the fact that it happens relatively early on. It happens in Fool's Errand, towards the end of Fool's Errand. But, the whole lead up to it, right? Fitz is very aware, both Fitz and Night Eyes are very aware that he's reaching the end of his life. And after he's gone, that loss permeates and colors Fitz's whole being, his whole mindset, his whole worldview is permanently altered by it. And you see that in the course of this trilogy, and I can understand why some people would, that's very upsetting, right? It's very upsetting, and so I can completely understand why there are people who would just far prefer the Farseer trilogy simply because it doesn't involve that, right? For me, it's one of the things that I think draws me most to this trilogy. I think as I get older personally, and I have dealt with more loss on a personal level, I find that particularly cathartic to deal with it in fiction sometimes too. I don't know that I want to get too much farther into that, but I will say that, you know, the way in which Fitz grieves for Night Eyes strikes me as it's very relatable for me personally. In the way that I've been grieving for my father since my father's passed a couple of years ago. There's something very personal and very individual I've found about the way that we grieve for such a close loss. And I think Robin Hobb captures it very beautifully. I will say that the death itself of Night Eyes in Fool's Errand was definitely very affecting, but the moment where I felt the most intensely the loss was the moment in Golden Fool when Kettricken is commiserating with Fitz, and Fitz feels that Kettricken is the only person who even begins to understand the depth and the magnitude of his loss. And that moment, that was what really got me, right? That was what really punched me in the gut and really made it real for me. And it felt very realistic, I feel like, in the way that, again, in the way that I have been grieving and my understanding of the grieving process. It felt very real, and very heartrending. It's one of the reasons why I think I like Golden Fool the best. It's not the only reason, but I think it's one of the reasons why I like Golden Fool the best, is that very specific moment with Kettricken and Fitz grieving the loss of Night Eyes. Because, again, a lot of Golden Fool in particular is about that. It's about that process. And it just worked for me very, very well. There's a lot of loss in this trilogy, and again, I think that's something that is very relevant as we get older, right? As we get older, it just naturally kind of happens more and more, right? It's change, right? And a lot of this trilogy is about change. It's about the way that when you change the world in fact changes, and it doesn't always change. It may change in some ways for the better, and we may be better for it. But even when that happens, there's often, maybe almost always, a sense of regret for what has been lost, and the idea that you can never really go home again, because home is not a place. Home is often a particular set of people, and sometimes in a very particular time and a very particular set of circumstances, that when it is gone, it can never be returned to again. It's simply it can never be returned to again, and we therefore, you know, at the end of the trilogy, Fitz is sort of reflecting on things and talking about how, you know, the important thing is to relish the time that you're given with the people that you really care about, because even if they're, you know, even if you don't lose them in the sense of them necessarily dying, but there are moments in time and specific contexts that once they're gone, and you can never return to them again. And, you know, that really colors his perception of the Fool, especially, I think, but also Night Eyes, and also Burrich, who's another significant character who also dies in this trilogy. And again, I can understand completely why there are people who just want to go back and read the Farseer trilogy again, because it's very sad, right? It's very sad. But that just, when it's done right, when it's done well, as Robin Hobb does it in this trilogy, it works very well for me, and it clicks for me in a way that I think I would not have, it might not have worked for me as well even like 5 to 10 years ago, but now it really does. So yeah, I do think Golden Fool is my favorite of the trilogy, not just because of the Night Eyes stuff, but also because of the stuff with Fitz and the Fool. I think that the relationship between Fitz and the Fool is one of the most nuanced, most complex, most fascinating relationship dynamics I've ever encountered in literature. And again, another like really particularly heartbreaking moment, right, is in the Golden Fool, when the Fool, you know, fully admits his feelings for Fitz, even knowing that Fitz will probably never be able to fully understand or return those feelings in the same kind of way. And Fitz eventually does sort of come to understand what he means by that when he says that he puts no limits on his love for Fitz. But it takes Fitz it's a process, and by the time he does understand it, they're at a point where the Fool feels like he has to leave. And it's really heartbreaking. It's one of the, I think, in my opinion, it's one of the most tragic things I've ever read, especially in fantasy literature. I love it too, because it's not as simple as the Fool is dead, right? The Fool does die, but that's not the catalyst for the tragedy, right? The tragedy is simply that Fitz can never give himself to the Fool as completely as the Fool can give would want that to happen. You know, not in as complete a way as the Fool would want or could ever expect to have. And so the Fool, out of fear and out of love, leaves, and that is ultimately like the tragedy of this, despite the fact that it ends, you know, on a pretty upbeat note, right? The whole trilogy ends on a very upbeat note, and Fitz is relatively probably the happiest he's been in his entire life by the end of this trilogy, with a wife and kids, and, you know, he's got not, you know, no, probably not everything he could have possibly asked for, but certainly a lot of what he has always wanted is finally his at the end of this book. But there is always that twinge of tragedy, that bittersweetness mixed in of that unfinished business with the Fool, which is what makes me so glad that there is another trilogy to look forward to, because I really need that to be resolved. So yeah, I really, really, really like this trilogy of novels. I also really loved the the complexity of the complexity of the way that Fitz approaches what to do about Icefire. You know, even before his decision is impacted by the fact that the Fool is being held prisoner or whatever. It's such a complex and nuanced situation, the idea of like bringing dragons back and what it would mean, and what and the fear, I think, that Fitz has about what the long-term repercussions of it will be if he does do this, despite the fact that the Fool wants him to so desperately and everybody else doesn't want him to so desperately, right? Again, it's that understanding that whatever he does is going to inflict a profound change on the world that is going to have very long-term repercussions and consequences that cannot necessarily be foreseen, even by someone like the Fool, who is a prophet, right? Who can sometimes see possible futures. This future is, there's still a lot of unknowns in the future, and that's really scary, trying to make that, when that kind of decision falls on Fitz's shoulders. I can understand his fear and his hesitancy over what that decision will entail, and how to make that decision, and, you know, why he has to be the one to make it. So I really love that aspect of it as well. None of the decisions are easy, and it's not simply for the fact that, again, that the Fool is captured by the Pale Woman, and his life hangs in the balance, which is obviously a big part of it, but it was never going to be easy to begin with. Like, it was never going to be an easy decision, especially because Fitz spends so much of especially the first half of Fool's Fate, where he's very torn, right? He's very torn in his loyalties between the Fool, who says we have to save the dragon, we have to free the dragon, and Chade and Dutiful, who are very much, well, you know, Eliania wants us to kill the dragon, so we should just kill the dragon, right? Like, why do you care? What harm does it do to just kill this dragon? Like, we haven't had dragons in forever. Why would it matter now that we don't bring them back? And it's really, you know, there's a lot of complexity there that I just really loved, and I really loved experiencing Fitz's own internal struggles with that. It was great. If anything, I would say, like, adding in the fact that the Pale Woman had captured the Fool and was saying, you know, if you kill the dragon, I won't forge him or whatever, you know, having the Fool's life hanging in the balance, if anything, made it less nuanced and flattened it a little bit for me, even though I was as desperate as Fitz was to, you know, save him. But yeah. So this is an amazing trilogy. I loved every page of it, and I don't know. I don't know if there's a whole lot else that I want to say about it, but what do you think of this trilogy? If you've read it, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss, because I have many thoughts and feelings about Fitz and the Fool and their relationship, and how wonderful and heartbreaking it is. And I cannot wait to continue the series with the, I believe this is the Rainwild Chronicles is the next one, and that's a 4-book series before we get to the final trilogy. So yeah, I'm already starting to feel preemptively a little bit sad about approaching the end of the Realm of the Elderlings, but I'm also just very excited to see what happens next. So yeah, leave a comment below, like this video if you like it, subscribe if you want, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!